Friends, hello. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. This is the YouTube platform of Channel 24. We have a live broadcast. Today, the 5th of August, is one of the most important days of the month and year for Ukraine. As the election of the President of the United States of America, the 47th President, is starting. We will talk about all the nuances of this election and how it affects Ukraine, as well as how much it depends on this election in the United States. Welcome to our guest, Alexandra Filippenko, Americanist politologist. Alexandra, hello. Igor, hello.
Игорь, здравствуйте.
Говорю вам доброе утро. Я понимаю, что у вас сейчас утро.
It's morning, exciting, but a good morning nonetheless, because we're finally coming to what we've been waiting 2 years for. 2 assassination attempts, 2 Democratic candidates, a huge number of court cases, all leading up to the U.S. election. Here, on November 5th, there are already localities in the U.S. that have voted. For example, in the township of Dixville Notch in the state of New Hampshire, 6 people have already voted, 4 Republicans and 2 independents. What are the trends right now? I'm looking at the quotes because the betting companies are also working, and they're giving Trump the edge a little bit. According to various estimates, Donald Trump has an advantage in the polls, but you need to keep an eye on the country as a whole, and especially on the swing states. After all, the U.S. election system is set up in such a way that you have to become president of every state to win every single state. This takes us back to 1776, when 13 independent colonies, 13 independent states, united. The United States is, of course, the United States, but the state, because it's also a state. Therefore, each state elects its own president. The election system is specifically arranged so that power is not concentrated in the capital and so that each state is important.
Чтобы власть не сосредотачивалась в столице, чтобы важное значение имел каждый отдельный штат. Поэтому нужно смотреть по штатам, по отдельным штатам, где кто опережает. В колеблющихся штатах, которые голосуют то за демократов, то за республиканцев, сейчас перевес...
You have to look at the swing states that vote Democrat or Republican. Right now, the margin varies from state to state, with Harris ahead in 3 states and Trump ahead in 4, but within the statistical margin of error, that is less than 1%. The focus right now is on these swing states, but there is some surprising news coming in. For example, the state of Iowa, which has always been on the maps where red and blue states. We have jokes in Ukraine, by the way, that the red color is an air alert, because Republicans...
А тут выясняется, что в действительности это вполне возможно штат, который проголосует за демократическую партию. Там перевес у Камалы Харрис 47-44.
Александра, немного экскурсов в историю. Вот вы проговорили, да, если смотреть на карту, то красные и синие цвета, да, уже в Украине, если честно, такой черный юмор, говорят, красный цвет – это воздушная тревога, потому что республиканцы, такие вот шутки у нас.
I'd like to ask you, historically, there are Republican states, there are Democratic states, pro-Democrat states. But those states that are wavering, what do you mean by that? Why are they always for one or the other? It's the South, the North. How do you divide it? Why that sentiment? A few states are in the Midwest, a few are on the right side of the American map, and 2 states are on the left side. Depending on these factors, how long will we have to wait for the results? If, for example, Kamala Harris wins in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, 3 swing states that are on the eastern side of the map, it would be a straight path to the White House for her. In case Donald Trump wins, we'll have to wait for results in 2 states that are located on the west side of the map are Nevada and Arizona. Nevada and Arizona are 2 states that historically take a very long time to process votes. We may have to wait another week for the results to be tallied. The thing is, the system is set up so that each state, depending on the number of residents, gives a certain number of electoral votes. For example, Pennsylvania, one of the swing states, gives 19 or 4 electoral votes. You need to collect 270 such votes to win. So if you can get 270 in the states on the right side of the American map, you don't have to wait for the count. The counting will take a long time because the inauguration is not until January 20th, and there is a long period of time between the election and the inauguration. And swing states vote differently because of the constant movement of people, a lot of migration, especially in important states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There's a huge number of immigrants, or Americans, whose parents were immigrants, from the Baltic states and Poland, and Kamala Harris is paying very serious attention to that. By the way, during a joint appearance with President Zelensky at the White House, Kamala Harris spoke directly to voters of Polish and Lithuanian descent, as well as those with roots in the Baltic states. She stated she would defend the North because Vladimir Putin aims to destroy Ukraine and expand into former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union countries. He won't stop.
Он будет захватывать и захватывать, останавливаться он не собирается. И Камала Харрис обращается напрямую к избирателям, у которых есть эти корни. И нужно сказать, что на прошлых выборах, поскольку, опять же, возвращаясь, я прошу прощения за технические подробности, но это важно, чтобы понимать систему.
Kamala Harris addressed voters directly, emphasizing the importance of winning individual states for electoral votes. For instance, in Pennsylvania, even a one-vote margin grants the winner all 19 electoral votes.
И все 19 электоральных голосов этого штата отходят победителю. Как, например, выборы 2000 года, Буш-Гор, когда долго-долго считали, пересчитывали, и в итоге 537 голосов, не тысяч, не десятков даже.
It's similar to the 2000 election, where George Bush Jr. won Florida by just 537 votes, which ultimately decided the election.
И он получил все электоральные голоса штата Флорида.
That's how the system works. By the way, about the recount, now we see the polls, you can look at any of them, and indeed, the gap is less than 1%. If the candidate's difference is 0.5% in some states and 0.3% in others, a recount will likely occur, potentially delaying the results. We may learn the president's identity within 24 hours, or it could take a week to receive updates.
Может быть, мы будем ждать целую неделю. Ну, или в течение этой недели, соответственно, постепенно узнавать. В любом случае, нужно следить за каждым штатом. Если так получится, что Пенсильвания, Мичиган и Висконсин...
It's crucial to monitor each state. If Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where a significant number of voters from the Baltic states and Poland reside, favor Kamala Harris, her victory will be assured, and we may know the result quickly.
Проголосуют за Камалу Харрис, то фактически победа у нее в кармане, мы действительно довольно-таки быстро узнаем этот результат.
Alexandra, you mentioned that there could be a manual recount, yes, and there we could be talking not thousands but hundreds of votes. Moldova held presidential elections, and Georgia had parliamentary elections, both marked by significant fraud. This raises the question, how real is the fraud in U.S. elections? While Russia attempted to influence the elections in 2016 and 2020, actual fraud is challenging due to the highly organized vote counting process in the United States.
Фальсификации очень сложно, какие бы то ни были фальсификации очень сложно предпринять, потому что...
First, 80 million Americans have already voted, indicating that elections have been underway for a month in some states where polling stations opened in September. Mail-in voting is also popular and secure in the U.S. having been used since the early 19th century. The envelopes for ballots are designed to be difficult to forge. First, there is one envelope in which a person puts a ballot, and it has no identifying marks, but special stamps on top, which are as difficult to forge as money. The person then puts that envelope in the next envelope, which has neither his name nor address, but has the postmark of the post office where the letter was sent from. That way, to guarantee security, no one will know who the person voted for. First, one group opens the stamped envelope and passes it to another group that opens the second envelope and counts the vote. This process applies to both postal ballots and in-person votes. These are, if I may say so, aquariums in which the commissions that count the votes sit. There are always representatives of the two parties sitting across from each other at a huge table. That is, if I am a representative of the Republican Party, a representative of the Democratic Party will sit across from me, and I will clearly see what is going on. You can't go to a corner, you can't hide, although you can go out for a short break, but at that moment, the vote counting is suspended between your pairs. Plus, around this aquarium, inside it, there are independent press observers. For example, the Associated Press allocated about 4,000 people to monitor the vote counting process.
чтобы они следили за голосованием. Плюс еще от либертарианцев, от зеленых. И вокруг, почему он называется аквариум, почему это стеклянные стены. И снаружи еще могут быть независимые наблюдатели, любой человек.
Libertarian and Green Party observers are also present. Why an aquarium? Because it's glass walls, and there can be independent observers outside. Any American with a passport can come in, sit down, set up a chair, grab a Coke, and watch the votes being counted. There is also video surveillance. Let us imagine how this could be accomplished if we are talking about electronic voting, not to be confused with remote voting, which is offered in Russia. To vote electronically, a person goes through 3 machines, first to receive a ballot, then to confirm the vote, and finally to cast it. A paper trail is generated from the 3rd machine and placed in a separate box. If the gap between candidates is less than 0.3%, the machine is checked, and then votes are manually counted from the ballot box.
Сначала машину просматривают, потом идут как раз в эту урну для бюллетеней и там пересчитывают вручную голоса.
Again, this always takes place at a table where there are representatives of the two parties at least. Plus there are observers from other parties and independent observers. The security of the election system is a very important foundation of American democracy. But of course, we realize that Russia has always tried to influence American elections. Iran is trying to influence. China is trying to influence. But voter fraud or vote stuffing is absolutely impossible here. However, chaos can be created in people's perceptions through the spread of fake information. Many articles in mainstream media discuss how various disinformation factories operate. Additionally, Russia today has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into counter-propaganda, which the Kremlin labels as truthful propaganda. According to the Kremlin, the American media are bad propagandists, and it is necessary to organize counter-propaganda. For this purpose, money was transferred from Russia through third-party companies in Tennessee at the rate of $400,000 a month. This money went to various American bloggers who actually carried out the Kremlin's agenda, receiving $400,000 a month for a few videos a week. They weren't elaborate clips or movies, just a conversational genre. Turn on the camera and talk. That's how Russia influenced the elections. That's how they're trying to influence. But as far as fraud is concerned, the American system started in 1776 and was approved in 1790.
утверждалось в 1790-е годы и на протяжении всего этого времени.
Over more than 2.5 centuries, American elections have been continuously improved, enhancing the system and its security, making large-scale fraud hard to imagine.
Поэтому, конечно, сложно себе представить какие-то масштабные фальсификации.
Alexandra, thank you very much for such details about how the voting takes place. Very interesting. I think every democracy in the world strives to reach such a level that people have no notion of fraud at all. I would like to ask you, of course, in terms of Ukraine, it is important to us who wins, but what are the key theses and differences between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump? What they are trying to draw attention to their person, so that voters will vote not for Trump, but for Harris, or vice versa, not for Harris, but for Trump. First and foremost is, of course, domestic politics.
В первую очередь, это, конечно, внутренняя политика. Здесь нужно быть честными и понимать, что все-таки война в Украине...
We must acknowledge that despite the war in Ukraine, the Middle East conflict, and other issues, these topics rank far lower in priority during elections. A great many Americans are single-issue voters who are only interested in one aspect of voting without diving into other issues.
Например, что касается Камалы Харрис, это репродуктивные права. Она продвигает репродуктивные права в США. И здесь я тоже вынуждена пойти в некоторые детали, поскольку Дональд Трамп ввел в Верховный суд 3 консервативных судей, которые отменили решение Roe vs. Wade,
For example,
благодаря которому 50 лет на территории США были разрешены.
Kamala Harris is pushing reproductive rights, and Donald Trump has appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, which made abortion legal across the United States for 50 years. Now, for example, the state of Texas bans abortion from the moment of conception, with no exceptions for cases of rape, incest, or endangering the life of the mother.
В связи с какими-то осложнениями. Его посадят на 99 лет и оштрафуют на $100 000. Всех медсестер.
A doctor who performs an abortion on a woman who dies on the operating table could get 99 years in prison and a $100,000 fine. Such restrictions are in place in 13 states. Others are less strict. But nevertheless, the issue is now actually on the table. Kamala Harris promises to advocate for federal reproductive rights legislation, including restoring Roe v. Wade and authorizing artificial insemination, as reproductive rights also encompass reproductive technology, which is banned in Texas. Many American women fear these restrictions could spread nationally if Donald Trump is reelected, leading to conditions similar to those in Texas. Meanwhile, Trump is urging voters to support him primarily for his promise to address the immigration crisis. Here, too, you have to honestly recognize that you don't have to be a Republican to understand what's going on at the U.S.-Mexico border. Indeed, there is a real humanitarian disaster going on there, and Donald Trump is promising to solve this immigration crisis. In December 2023, a record 3,000 people crossed the U.S. border illegally, raising safety concerns for everyone. The court systems can't handle so many cases. The wall doesn't work because the 3,000 kilometers long U.S. border with Mexico only has a wall for 100 kilometers, and the rest is the Rio Grande River and desert. We've all seen the footage of illegal immigrants crossing the Rio Grande River, which is not that deep in some places.
Река Рио-Гранде, да, на 2000 остальных, там река Рио-Гранде, пустыня Сонора, но мы все видели эти кадры, как нелегальные иммигранты пересекают реку Рио-Гранде вброд, она не такая...
And they're wading through it. Accordingly, immigration policy is the #1 topic for those who support Donald Trump. He promises deportations, and there are various estimates that there are anywhere from 11 million illegal immigrants living in the U.S., a minimum number. But perhaps the real number is closer to 20 million. Thus, residents of southern states who don't feel safe and see it as a threat to the American economy and jobs believe immigrants are taking away jobs and are therefore more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Democrats have yet to convince Republicans that they can also pass effective immigration legislation. Therefore, many Americans may not be enamored with Donald Trump, but believe that he is the one who can handle the immigration crisis. Some people don't like Kamala Harris, but they're afraid that their children, their daughters, won't have the option to have an abortion in case of life-threatening or rape. These are key reasons why people vote Democrat or Republican. By the way, in early November, Google published data on how search queries in the U.S. changed over the last month before the election. For example, the question, "Can my husband find out who I voted for?" rose in search queries from low positions to the top 100. This suggests that many Republican women from deep red communities might
просто с какого-то тысячи какого-то места в первую сотню взлетел вопрос, который звучит так: может ли мой муж узнать, за кого я проголосовала?
Are thinking about voting for the Democratic Party.
Большое количество женщин-республиканок из республиканских комьюнити, из глубоко красных комьюнити, думают о том, что они, возможно,
but do not plan to inform friends, relatives, or even their own husbands. So the surveys we see may well be skewed.
И поэтому опросы, которые мы видим, они вполне возможно могут быть лукавыми. Вполне возможно.
It is quite possible that these shadow voters, these shadow votes, really cannot be traced in any way before the elections themselves. So the results, of course, could be very unexpected. Alexandra, we also know that in addition to the presidential election, there will be elections for the Senate and the lower House of Representatives. And so I wanted to ask you in terms of the impact on helping Ukraine, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Can we call November 5th D-Day for Ukraine, or is it still a long process? I mean, there's also Congress, where Republicans, as I understand it, are also seeking a majority in the lower house. To what extent is it really D-Day, or can't the process turn 180 degrees? Of course, it's important to keep an eye on who ends up in Congress. Congressional elections are these extremely important elections. It is worth just remembering one example from our recent history, highlighting the Aid to Ukraine bill, allocating $60 billion. It's important to note that the President, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the Treasury Department are all led by Democrats, and they are prepared to allocate $60 billion. While Democrats voted in the Senate and everything is set, the Republican Party holds a majority in the House. And what's more, the preponderance is not just Republicans, it's Trumpist Republicans, 13 Trumpists. And it's important to separate the Republican Party from the Trumpists here.
Они тормозили, они не выводили на голосование законопроект, у которого, очевидно, была поддержка.
They delayed and did not bring to a vote a bill that obviously had support and enough votes to pass. That's why it wasn't brought up for a vote. If they thought it was unpassable, they would have brought it out. It would have failed. The issue is closed, and America doesn't allocate $60 billion and so on. Exactly the same situation if Donald Trump becomes president and at least one House of Congress remains Democratic. This is an important point because we are not talking about a dictatorship or a monarchy, but about the American system, where there is a system of checks and balances, and Congress can act contrary to the president because they are equal branches of government.
взаимных и так далее, и так далее. Ровно та же ситуация в случае, если Дональд Трамп президент и хотя бы одна из палат Конгресса демократическая. Ровно один в один ситуация. Все-таки мы говорим не про диктатуру, не про монархию, а мы говорим про американскую систему, где есть система сдержек и противовесов, и, соответственно, Конгресс может в противовес президенту действовать, и это равные ветви власти. Более того, там еще и суд, Верховный суд может блокировать любые решения, считая их неконституционными, но это уже третий вопрос.
Moreover, the Supreme Court can block any decisions, considering them unconstitutional, although this happens very rarely. In any case, it is important to keep an eye on who will be in Congress, because the Democratic Party has a chance to pull to its side the House of Representatives, which is fully elected, 435 representatives. The Senate, on the other hand, is renewed by 1/3. Historically, 1/3 of the seats are re-elected every 6 years. 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election, and the Democratic Party faces challenges in that segment, which could lead to a significant shift. The Senate might become Republican, while the House of Representatives could turn Democratic. Importantly, if at least one chamber has a different composition than the White House, the president's situation becomes much more complicated. And plus, again, using the Ukraine aid bill as an example, let's remember, the Republicans were ready to vote, they voted, everything was fine for the Ukraine aid bill, but the Trumpists slowed things down. And even if Donald Trump is president, the upper house is Republicans, the lower house is Republicans. You have to remember that Republicans should be distinguished from Trumpists. When Vladimir Zelensky visited Congress, he met with Lindsey Graham, a key figure in the Republican Party who has visited Kiev multiple times and actively supports Ukraine. The Republican Party is not uniform in its views. While we hope to see more support for Ukraine in the White House and Congress, the American political system is complex and requires careful observation. Even if there are Republicans everywhere, we should not take it tragically. Going back to 1776, I apologize for the historical excursion, Ihor. The American system is very clumsy. It may seem liberal and fast, but once it's turned around to help someone, turning it around is going to be very difficult, even for Donald Trump. Thank you, Alexandra. No need to apologize. Your details are important for viewers to understand how elections are run in the U.S. You mentioned the MAGA group and the Trump Republicans, which is crucial to the discussion. But here's what I'm getting at. Even a Republican like Mike Turner wrote letters to the White House, supports Ukraine, and says, yes, give permission to hit Russian Federation territory. So to summarize, yes, your word is right. Republicans are very different and should not be perceived solely as Trump supporters. So what does the Kremlin expect?
Кремль. Чего ожидает Александра Кремль? Вот официально якобы, да, что говорят? Они так шутят.
Here's officially, allegedly, what are they saying? They're joking. I understand. Yes, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, says that Russia has no influence on the United States election and that they don't care who becomes president. But from what I understand, the Kremlin still wants Trump in office more because there is a lot of information that Trump allegedly had contacts with Putin after the full-scale invasion began, and even Elon Musk has spoken to him on multiple occasions. The Kremlin appears to be interested in Trump. My question is whether Trump would risk Ukraine to end the war and claim, I stopped this bloody war. It's important to note that Trump was already president. This isn't a surprise in the White House. Furthermore, we haven't seen significantly closer or friendlier relations between Moscow and Washington.
И что-то мы не заметили каких-то невероятных, потрясающих близких договоренностей между Москвой и Вашингтоном, каких-то новых...
This all didn't happen, but the Kremlin has an interest in seeing chaos reign in Washington, and Donald Trump brings that chaos one way or another because he has a penchant for broad gestures. For example, he issued a slew of executive orders in 2016, which is no surprise.
Например, в 2016 году, опять же, это не сюрприз будет, он издавал большое количество исполнительных указов президента. Вообще президент – глава исполнительной власти, а исполнительный указ президента – это...
The president, as head of the executive branch, has the power to issue such decrees in exceptional cases, acting as a kind of emergency law. Normally, laws are passed by Congress, and the president signs and executes them. But Donald Trump used this right like no one else, and his decrees fell on Americans like autumn leaves. Congress and the courts have had to deal with these decrees, many of which do not comply with the Constitution and American law. It was like a snowball that kept piling up, and eventually there was no time left for foreign policy. And then the pandemic hit, and the situation changed. It's likely that Trump will again issue executive orders like this regarding deportation or building a wall. Perhaps the courts will overturn his decisions, but that will only increase domestic chaos.
И заниматься внешней политикой не было. Но потом грянула пандемия, и ситуация вообще в целом изменилась. Но, видимо, Дональд Трамп точно...
With this domestic focus, America will be less interested in Europe and its affairs, and the Kremlin, it seems to me, is counting on this chaos, not specifically on Trump himself. Also, regarding Ukraine, it should be remembered that Trump's first impeachment was related to his call to Vladimir Zelensky.
Если Америка будет сконцентрирована на своих делах, какая Европа, что там происходит, пусть сами разбираются. Поэтому Кремль, как мне кажется, делает ставку на хаос в американской политике, не конкретно на Дональда Трампа. Они не...
In this conversation, Trump actually demanded information from Zelensky about Burisma, the company where Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, worked. Zelensky refused to comply with this demand, thus earning the approval of the international community as a defender of international law.
Предоставить ему информацию о компании Burisma, компании, где работал сын Джо Байдена, Хантер Байден, нефтяная компания, которая работала в Украине, и Владимир Зеленский, согласно международному праву.
After the call was made public, Trump's first impeachment took place, because the president has no right to interfere in the internal affairs of another state.
Один из таких важных моментов, когда мировые лидеры стали говорить о Владимире Зеленском как о защитнике международного права, в отличие от президента США. И после того, как информация об этом звонке стала известна, произошел первый импичмент. Это вмешательство во внутренние дела другого государства. Это президент не имеет права такие вещи совершать.
So Donald Trump appears to have a personal beef with Vladimir Zelensky, and we all know Trump to be a pretty vindictive person. These are important points to consider in American politics. I highly recommend watching the recently released movie, The Apprentice, which explores Donald Trump's rise in the 80s and early 90s. It's not only interesting, but also helps understand his need to maintain a specific image.
Это фильм про 80-е годы, начало 90-х годов. В целом очень интересный, но он хорошо объясняет, кто такой Дональд Трамп и как важно ему представлять себя определенным образом, как важен ему имидж. И почему, например, там стену на границе...
That's why the wall on the Mexican border is closely associated with Donald Trump. He took many photos there, praised it, and promoted it as the most amazing wall. If Trump realizes he won't have a chance to shake hands with Vladimir Zelensky or Vladimir Putin to present himself as a peacemaker waiting for a Nobel Prize, he may not pursue that path at all. He will leave it up to his advisors and professionals, realizing that if this is how the situation plays out over the course of 3 years, the office of the Ukrainian president can hardly be expected to simply give up.
Никаких особенных уступок Дональду Трампу и получения, соответственно, вот этих вот фотографий и картинок, тогда он и не будет этим заниматься вовсе. И он отдаст это на откуп своим советникам и людям профессиональным, люди, которые будут понимать, что если на протяжении...
So the situation here is quite ambiguous, given Donald Trump's personality and how important it is for him to show himself always as a winner, entering negotiations with the hope of a successful outcome.
Вполне неоднозначно, учитывая личность Дональда Трампа, учитывая то, насколько ему важно показывать себя всегда победителем, вступать в переговоры, ожидая, что ничего не получится, вот это не в духе Дональда Трампа. И, конечно же, если он что-то сможет получить, то он это...
If he gets something in return, he'll go for it. Perhaps the proposals that his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, made in one of his podcasts about a 4-kilometer demilitarized zone, like the 38th parallel, with international observers, may be a thing of the past.
Демилитаризованная зона на 4 километра наподобие 38-й параллели, 2 километра с одной стороны, 2 километра с другой стороны, международные наблюдатели это контролируют. Вполне возможно, это все уйдет в прошлое, и, может быть, Дональд Трамп в действительности...
Donald Trump can really start to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, especially realizing the current difficult economic situation in Russia and the fact that China, the main rival of the United States, has started its trade war with Trump. China is a key issue for him, especially since China is now helping Russia in every way possible, including in circumventing sanctions. Of course, the U.S. and Donald Trump, if he becomes president, will perceive Russia as a proxy for China in this situation, and therefore try to counteract that. So we can really expect unexpected moves from Donald Trump. But in any case, it is clear that he will bring chaos to the White House and reduce the ability of the U.S. to pay attention to international affairs. Alexandra, I wanted to ask you about Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee. Tell me, please. I have the impression that this is a man who got the jackpot from Donald Trump, but he himself is not politically mature enough to debate in the United States of America in the presidential election and to be a vice presidential candidate. He's already said so many, I think, undiplomatic things. For example, he once said he didn't care about Ukraine. Then he said some very curious words, and in the debate with the Democratic representative, he was somewhat softer, much softer, and that says a lot. It opens up a big conversation regarding the future of American political history and the Democratic Party.
Он был значительно мягче, и это нам очень многое говорит, это вообще открывает нам большой разговор относительно будущего американской политической истории в смысле демократической партии. Если J.D. Vance воспринимает...
If J.D. Vance is perceived as the future of the Republican Party, the future of the Republican Party and a follower of Donald Trump, now as the vice presidential nominee under Donald Trump, this is actually Donald Trump's ideal right-hand man. If he's perceived that way, the way he talked to Tim Walz and how he handled those negotiations is very different from the kind of debates we've been hearing lately. You're right. In a Tucker Carlson interview, he stated that he doesn't care about what's happening in Ukraine, expressing this as a senator from Ohio. As a senator from Ohio, this sounds understandable to his constituents, as Americans are always focused on domestic politics for the most part. Ohio is an agricultural state that was hit hard during the pandemic, and many voters felt that funds should be allocated to help the farmers of the state. So J.D. Vance is an important figure in the Republican Party, although he is not a follower of Trumpism, at least in his behavioral style. He behaves very differently. He's softer. Yes, he makes mistakes, like when he says he doesn't care about what's going on in Ukraine or mentions stories about immigrants. But that's more aimed at voters in Midwestern agricultural states. This figure is important, but of course he will show up in the future.
Себя Дональд Трамп, он гораздо мягче. Да, он совершает эти ошибки, но все-таки он совершает эти ошибки в плане, вот, например, того, что ему плевать, что происходит в Украине, или...
Donald Trump chose him as his vice presidential nominee primarily because he is young. Donald Trump talked a lot about age during his campaign, but he is 78 years old, and if he is elected president, he will be older than Joe Biden was when he was inaugurated 4 years ago.
Скажем так, в будущем скорее будет проявляться. Дональд Трамп его выбрал в качестве кандидата в вице-президенты в первую очередь, потому что он молодой. Все-таки Дональд Трамп очень много говорил про возраст Джо Байдена.
So criticizing Donald Trump in that context would be inappropriate. J.D. Vance is a young American politician, and he balances Donald Trump in terms of age.
Он будет старше Джо Байдена, когда Джо Байден был инаугурирован 4 года назад. Поэтому критика здесь связана, критика Дональда Трампа здесь неуместна была бы в данный уже момент. А вот Джей Ди Венс — это молодой американский политик. И он балансирует, скажем так, Дональда Трампа в смысле возраста.
He was chosen for that very reason, although it was at a time when Joe Biden was still the Democratic nominee. So I think if Kamala Harris had been the nominee at that point, Donald Trump might have picked a woman for vice president to balance out the female vote. Alexandra, We were reminiscing with you about the fact that for a long time, in the fall, spring of this year, and winter of last year, there was no aid to Ukraine. This went on for 6 or 7 months because there were political issues in the United States. How much aid to Ukraine can be delayed after the elections on the 5th? Trump has mentioned plans to fire 2,000 people and install his own, which could impact the power transfer process. This may push Ukraine down the priority list again.
Вот сам процесс передачи полномочий может он влиять на помощь Украины, потому что тогда Украина может опять-таки отойти на третий-десятый план.
All concentration will be on internal political processes. Again, the AFU will be short of shells. Here, of course, it is difficult to predict how things will develop. Everything may take longer because the situation can change in very different ways.
Если мы говорим про все-таки избрание демократического президента, то в любом случае ситуация должна быстрее развиваться. Но важно, конечно,
If we're still talking about electing a Democratic president, things have to move faster either way. But it's going to be important to look at who the national security advisors are, who's going to be around the president, because even Kamala Harris should not be given exceptional expectations. From the looks of it, if she becomes president, she's also going to turn that over to a man named Philip Gordon, her current national security advisor. He will probably remain her national security advisor in the White House as well. He always says pretty much the same thing that Donald Trump says, only in much softer terms, saying that Americans should help Europe less and Europe should be more concerned about its security. He does not say that we should leave the North Atlantic Alliance and so on, but financial issues, of course, now play an important role, including for the Democratic Party itself. Thank you, Alexandra, for this conversation and for taking the time on U.S. presidential election day. I appreciate your clear and accessible explanation of the voting process, history, and culture. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much, Alexandra Filippenko, our American political scientist. Please like, comment, and share our conversation to help more people understand.